Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheranism. We hear new stories, examine old heroes of faith, and dig into the who, how, what, and why of history making. So whether you're a Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots, a history lover, or a person looking for stories of trials, tragedies, and triumphs, you'll find what you're looking for right here. Today's guest is Elisabeth Urtel. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I think so.
Urtel?
It's up for debate in my family.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, that's always interesting. Elisabeth had graduated from Bethany Lutheran College, where she has studied church music and religion. She received her Master's of Arts in Lutheran Theological Studies from Bethany Lutheran Theological Seminary in 2016. Her recent publication, Anna B. Hoppe, Her Life in Hymnody, draws upon her thesis for this program, and that's the topic for today's podcast. In December 2016, she earned her Master of Church Music in Organ from Concordia University of Wisconsin, and currently she is a PhD candidate in Historical Theology at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. She's studied abroad as well through Concordia. She was honored to be a guest researcher at the Herzog August Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel, Germany in 2019. Her research interests include women in early modern Germany and American Lutheran history, and also recovering a greater appreciation for Lutheran musical heritage. She's authored several articles and has been a guest lecturer at several Lutheran institutions and conferences. Elisabeth is a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, the ELS, and is an active as a church musician and pianist in southern Minnesota. While not performing, she enjoys reading, writing, traveling, running languages, and history. So Elisabeth, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So our topic for today is about another female musician, maybe a century removed from our time about, roughly speaking. How were you introduced to the subject of Anna Hoppe?
Well, I got an email that I wasn't expecting to get from a professor of mine at Bethany in my second year of graduate school. And he simply said, "Elisabeth, what do you know about Anna Hoppe? Do some digging. I think that there's a thesis or a dissertation here, and let me know what you find." And instantly I was curious, and I started doing some digging right away, even though the thesis was a couple years off. And it led me on a crazy journey of about 2 years of researching and putting together a paper and collecting hymns and all of that. And years later, after that, it turned into a book.
So what led one Lutheran academic to ask 1 century ago, why not original American Lutheran hymns? That's what Anna Hoppe is most notable for. But why did he have to ask that question?
Well, he was talking in his article about the Universal Lutheran Hymnal, an idea that Henry Melchior Muhlenberg had started shortly after he came to America, when he was producing a hymnal for his church body. And he recognized the unifying power of the hymnal and kind of longed for the day when Lutherans would all sing themselves together in faith. Because when people are singing the same songs and the same texts, they're also confessing their faith together. So he lamented the fact that Lutherans in America had spent so much time collecting German hymns and Norwegian hymns and Finnish hymns and Swedish hymns and hymns from even outside of Lutheranism, but he said that Lutheranism had yet to produce Lutheranism in America had yet to produce its own unique hymnic voice. And he kind of recognized this in Anna's writing. The quote at the end of the article, which I didn't include in my book, is, "Neither in English nor in other languages has America as yet, in any denomination whatsoever, produced any great hymnist. All we have of great worth is imported, whether it be Lutheran or Reformed." So he sees in her writing a quality that they need, especially for the hymnal that he's involved in producing.
Yeah, and he asked too, why are we so super critical, or are we so super critical as to stifle originality within our own church, the Lutheran Church? So why were hymns a guarded and contested issue for Lutherans in America?
Well, in the Lutheran understanding of hymns in the church as also the proclamation of the word, not just decoration for our service or something we do when the pastor isn't preaching. hymns are regarded as being confessions of the faith. And when you make a collection of them, such as a hymnal, you're basically putting together a confessional document, kind of like the Book of Concord, but not on that subscription level. So if you look at the early founding documents of the Missouri Synod, when they're talking about materials that the church should use, they're not only talking about Bibles and subscribing to the Book of Concord and all of those things, but they're also concerned about Orthodox hymnals. And Walther and others we know are very concerned about using correct hymns that express Lutheran theology because, again, they're not just something you do for fun. They're something that teaches you the faith. And you belong to the church that, confesses the faith in those songs. So the issue of language transition and borrowing hymns from the English and American sources that might not necessarily be Lutheran was kind of a hot issue at this point. As they're transitioning into English, it was a question of how do we sing our faith expressed in German or Scandinavian hymns in English, and how do we, or even can we sing the faith in English as we used to. So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember one quote from your book, Anna Hoppe kind of sympathized with Luther trying to get Greek or Hebrew to speak German, just a language issue. And she said, now I have to make German speak English. And that was especially to fit it in, if you're trying to make it fit into a recognizable, the original tune, must have been extremely difficult. And hard to be original. This is
kind of an issue, though. I mean, in the early 19th century, there were other people that were before, I guess, the translators we know today, like Catherine Winkworth and all of that, who were trying to translate the German hymns into English. And they were just too literal and kind of stodgy, and no one wanted to use them. So it kind of took a lot of Victorian English influence to finally get it to go that direction. So it was just an ongoing thing, how can we think as Germans and, translate our culture into a language that's totally different.
Yeah, and I guess for many of the immigrant groups, there wasn't really an immediate need for that. So kind of naturally, as the kids who were bilingual, well, we don't really need English as much, but that's another topic. But clearly the language changed for these immigrants, and they needed original Lutheran hymns.
Yeah.
So our subject, or your subject, our focus for this episode, Anna Hoppe, can you tell us a bit about her early life? Maybe to start off, what led to her interest in music and hymns?
Sure. Well, her parents were immigrants from Pomerania. It looked like they came over from Germany as old Lutherans, or what we would call old Lutherans in the old country, as well as some of her extended family. And growing up, she talked about how her parents would sing hymns at devotions, and I think their grandmother might have lived with them. She also would sing hymns and talk about her childhood in Germany. And she said that they were all musically inclined, especially the boys, but they didn't have money to take lessons. So I assume they did a lot of singing at home, and I think plunking around on the family piano and whatever that entailed. But she recalls using the German hymnal that her family had brought over from Germany, and I'm not sure which one that would be, but it obviously was one that did not go the way of the Enlightenment, but was more older Lutheran confessional hymns. And also just attending her church. I think the hymnal that they were using at her church, St. John's in Milwaukee, would have been the Evangelische Lutherische Gesangbuch, 1872. And that was mostly 1600s and 1700s German hymns. So she had a strong foundation in hymns, both at home and in the church, and kind of probably in reading too, and in the other learning that she did.
So apart from her family, who or what were some major influences in her life?
Well, in her early life, she speaks about her pastors as being a strong influence on her life. In terms of spiritual formation, a lot of it was her childhood pastor and confirmation pastor, Johannes Spotting. And Johannes Spotting is actually one of the confessional leaders in the Wells that or in the Wisconsin Synod that gets it to turn away from the General Council and join the Synodical Conference. And he's in fact involved in the founding of that. So she said that he influenced her a lot, and he was a wonderful Christian man. As an adult, John W. O. Brenner became her pastor at age 18 or 19. And then he was involved in kind of the other end of the Synodical Conference, where he was defending doctrine and making sure that the Wisconsin Synod handled the English transition correctly, and leading his congregation through all of that with good hymns and spiritual leadership. She also talks about her teachers at St. John's being a strong influence and very musical and supportive. In the different people that she mentions in her childhood, or like theological teachers such as Franz Pieper and other people, it shows that she was also well-read, and she was probably in tune to what was going on in the Missouri Synod and elsewhere in the Synodical Conference. It's just interesting when you think about those two pastors at St. John's, one followed the other, but Botting is the one that really starts off the Synodical Conference, and he's pastor for a long time. And then John W. O. Brenner doesn't make it as a pastor all the way until the end. He retires before that, but he kind of sees the Synodical Conference through the breakup years, kind of. So it's like the two bookends of the Synodical Conference in one church. And both of them, I guess, must have been good administrators and leaders, especially being in charge of a 2,000 member congregation in a school in the Northwestern Lutheran. So, yeah.
Yeah. So not only were they major influences in her personal life, just as her personal pastors, but if you need to know, especially Wisconsin Synod history or Synodical Conference history, both men are major figures in American Lutheran history in general. So she was kind of at the heart of a lot of what was going on in American Lutheranism, especially in Wisconsin.
If you think about I think like the city layout of Milwaukee, I know that sounds kind of funny, but I think that was probably in a way what brought the Missouri and Wisconsin synods closer together. It's like you have these men who are leaders in Milwaukee, and you know that they have a few blocks away a Missouri Synod congregation that is just as influential, and they're all kind of talking to each other because they speak the same language. So it's kind of interesting when you think about not just in the Wisconsin Synod, but the other leaders that are in the same area that would have had an influence.
Yeah, and this is just off my memory, off the top of my head, but I think back in 1872, so about 15 years before Anna was born, I think the Synodical Conference was founded at St. John's Lutheran in Milwaukee at her own home congregation.
It's not at that building. I think they had a previous building that was closer to Historic Trinity. This is a fact that I get wrong in the book, but they had an original smaller building, and that was where they had it. But it was St. John's that hosted it, of course, with Pastor Botting being kind of over that congregation at that time.
Well, very interesting. So you mentioned family life and worship, and also her pastors. What did Hoppe think about family worship? I think you bring it out a little bit later in your book, but I think maybe we should talk about it now in her early life.
Well, I think that in line with what I said about the Lutheran purpose of worship and hymns, she really viewed it as the work of catechizing and confessing the faith. It's something that was integral to her faith formation, to have a family that went to church together, and to have a family that had family devotions and regularly talked about the faith. And it kind of shows how her parents and just the type of devotional life that they had at home too was also something that really strengthened her theology and her spiritual formation. So they weren't just people that kind of went to church on Sunday and that was it. It sounded like they talked a lot about the faith at home and had family devotions. And she was able to say what her extended family believed, and that they made confessions of their faith. She knew that they were all strong Lutherans who loved the Lord and wanted her to have that same faith.
So we're going to take kind of a weird weird, but a odd kind of backwards direction. So we just established Anna Hoppe was a woman of faith who loved to write hymns, and she wrote a lot of them.
Yeah.
But in fact, she began by writing other things. So in what other ways did she publicly wield her pen? It wasn't just a notebook either. This was public stuff.
Yeah. Well, she said that she started writing when she was in grade school around age 12 or something. And she wrote just poems, I think, on different topics. She said, I wrote a poem on angels. I wrote a poem in a yearbook for a classmate. She has an interest in American history, especially like the Civil War era and 19th century history. That comes out later, but she said that she started writing things like about the Battle of Gettysburg and about other things. And the first couple of poems that I found, I still don't even know where exactly I found them on the internet, but they were poems kind of about patriotic events or maybe even like nativism or nationalism problems in the US. I can't remember exactly what that is, but she, I think, always had an interest in her country and American history, and that was where she started, at least before the Northwestern Lutheran. I guess I don't know when she started writing spiritual poetry, but it came later.
Okay. So you also describe how Hoppe was a very regular contributor to the Northwestern Lutheran, which was a Wisconsin Synod publication. I haven't really paged through that publication at all, and I'm sure you did in your research. Was it unusual for a woman to be a regular contributor?
Well, she's the only known female contributor writing regularly in both the Northwestern Lutheran and the Lutheran Witness of that time. I think in some of the other Lutheran periodicals, there are some, poems or something written by women. I'm not quite sure. But in the Northwestern Lutheran, that first year, it's basically just the two editors that are kind of writing back and forth, and some homiletical ideas, some short exegetical points and things, some things about current issues. It's really unclear to see where she starts writing, because there are a few things that don't have a name by them that I think could be hers. But she starts writing in August after it's been going about 8 months, I think. And then, the rest is history. The very first year of the Northwestern Lutheran. So I think that it's probably safe to say that she's the very first English Wisconsin Synod writer who's female in any publication like that. It's really interesting to page through those first few issues of things. I mean, not just for her hymns, but for the other things that they included and what's going on.
Yeah, some other articles she writes about, it's related to World War I, and like you said, the nativism nationalism debates too. So she wasn't simply writing poetry as significant as that was. She was an engaged writer and thinker on what was going on.
Yeah. And I was kind of thinking too, when people write letters to the editor or comments online today, they might just get angry about an issue and say something, but it's like she actually is presenting a well thought out logical argument where she says, well, this is why you're wrong. Here are 10 points or whatever, why I'm going to refute your argument. And, it's all very well thought out, critical thinking and all of that. And it's probably something that she learned through her school education through the 8th grade and further reading.
So you've established that she was close to the heart of the Wisconsin Synod, a major contributor, a regular contributor, at least, to the Northwestern Lutheran. Her relationships, kind of her professional relationships, kind of pop up in a very surprising place. At least it kind of was not a natural one for me to come across. So you describe the relationship Hoppe had with other music-minded Lutherans. Can you describe some of these relationships and their importance to Hoppe's overall story?
Sure. So after the Northwestern Lutheran has been being published for a few years, around 1918 to 1919, I have to establish the exact date. Her poems were reprinted in other Lutheran periodicals. Some of them were in the Lutheran Witness. Some of them were in the American Lutheran, which is published by something called the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau. This happens kind of because of the quadricentennial and promoting the Missouri Synod. And then there's another one called the Lutheran, which is now ULCA. They borrowed that from the General Council, and I guess when they merged, they just kept the name. And one of her poems is reprinted in the Lutheran, which is published in Philadelphia. And at that point, it is ULCA. And an Augustana Synod professor sees her poem, and he gets excited about it because he sees that she's an American Lutheran hymn writer who is exemplifying this unique American Lutheran voice that he's hoping to include in the hymnal. He's a member of a 3-person hymnal committee for the Augustana Synod, and his name is Adolf Hult. 2 of the other members on the committee are Carl J. Sodergren and Luther Malmberg. Adolf Hult is a church history professor at the seminary, and like it seems to be with many people that are closely in touch with history, he's also very conservative. He kind of comes to confessionalism through the way of biblicism, and I guess the part in the Augustana Synod that is trying to counter the whole biblical inerrancy argument. There's some confessionals that pop up because of that. But he's interested in church music. He's read about Muhlenberg's hymnal and the whole idea of the one Lutheran hymnal. And yeah, he's very devoted to the Lutheran tradition of music. So he asks her, this is just my hypothesis. I don't know if there's an actual letter, but this is what I think happened. He sends her a letter asking her if she would compose hymns on all the gospel and epistle lessons for the whole church year. And the idea, this is again my theory, was that they would structure the upcoming hymnal around the church year. So a lot of people that aren't familiar with the ELS don't know this, but the hymnal that we use is based not on like a topical arrangement, but on the church year arrangement. So like Advent 1, Advent 2, Advent 3, Advent 4, all the way through Epiphany, Lent, and everything else. German hymnals are traditionally arranged by topic. So it'll start like with morning hymns and praise and worship. And then like at the end, it might be evening or something like that. In Norwegian hymnals in America, and before that, they're arranged by Sunday in the church year. And there is an advantage to doing it this way. In some ways, it helps the pastor who might not know a lot about hymns out with selection of the hymns. And it also keeps people kind of on track with the lectionary. It's like you have this curated collection of hymns that are specific to each Sunday instead of saying, well, I just have a month of Advent hymns here, and now I'll just kind of put things where I think they fit. So he kind of liked that arrangement, and I think he saw Anna as the hymn writer that would kind of help shape the project in a way. And he introduced her to supposedly the rest of the hymnal committee. We know she sent letters to Carl Sodergren, and they met at one point. Another person who's involved with the project this time, who pops up later, is Ernest Edwin Ryden. And he is on the other end of the theological spectrum. He is actually a liberal, and he's interested in ecumenical endeavors and other things, but he's also a hymnologist. And she sends letters to him. They're both kind of the same age. They're both working on translations and things. And he eventually writes about her in his book, The Story of Our Hymns. So we know they were friends. There is another pastor, and I don't exactly know how they make this connection, but there is an Augustana Synod professor in Buffalo, New York, who is writing his own bilingual German and English hymnal, and supposedly to counteract the effects of World War I and the anti-German sentiment that's going on. And she actually gets involved with helping out their project as well. So there's another 30 hymns in this kind of independent project called the Selah Songbook, which is by another Augustana Synod pastor. So it's interesting. I think that what happened was she might have contacted, or Hult contacted her first, and then kind of introduced her to a circle of friends, and they started writing back and forth and doing different things. And she built up I guess, a lot of connections and kind of a synod that you wouldn't really expect to hear about for a Wisconsin Synod woman.
Yeah. And I don't know too much about the Augustana Synod, and I don't think we've talked about it much in this podcast yet in any of our episodes, but it's a Swedish American synod, correct?
Yeah,
or is that not true?
Well, they start out being, the Augustana Synod starts out being Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish.
Okay.
The Swedish part comes from like a division of the General Synod called the Synod of Northern Illinois. They're kind of centralized around like Iowa, Northern Illinois, Southern Wisconsin. And they break off from them for cultural reasons. They kind of want to keep their Swedish culture and Swedish hymns, and they have the lay church pietist influence. And then they join together with the Norwegian and Danish portions to form a larger Augustana Synod. The Norwegian and Danish component actually leaves. So now they're kind of in the same situation the ELS was in, where they're this small fragment that's left after the rest of their synod leaves and joins the other Norwegian synods. And then they join the General Council. But what has just happened in 1918 is that the General Council goes ahead and merges with the ULCA, the more liberal group. And they actually don't like that, and they back out of it. So they're once again standing on their own and trying to defend their language and culture against a synod that doesn't really know a lot about it and doesn't preserve it in the same way that they do. From during this time when the hymnal is being produced, which ends up being published in 1925, they're very much on their own. And there are people that are in the synod that are also kind of interested in the Missouri Synod and confessionalism and biblicism. And then there's the other side that's kind of looking over at the ULCA thinking, well, could that be us? What would happen if we went that direction and we had a merger? And eventually they do become part of the American Lutheran Conference, and they start to go that direction. But for this decade, it's like there's kind of a divide. And you get a sense of that when you read their periodicals and other materials and things, that there are two different camps and they could really go either way. And this also kind of rests on the hymnal.
So all the more amazing that they included her in that project, a total outsider when they're struggling with their own direction. So I guess, I don't know, what's the weight of Anna's influence or impact on the Augustana? If you had to say it in one sentence, to summarize it, what was the measure of her impact on this hymnal project or their music?
Well, it looks like they asked her to, or Hult, I think, asked her to do a cycle of all of the gospel and epistle hymns, or at least started with the gospels and then did the epistles, but they ended up having about 23 of them make it in. Some of them are translations. They kind of still count it as her hymn. They do have a lot of hymns from American Lutheran translators that are kind of new. But the interesting thing that happens is that there is kind of a church year section in the hymnal, but it's overall topical. So it kind of shows that they were kind of starting to head one direction with the organization, but it ended up being something else. And you have to look at it to see what's going on, but they have a specific hymn about the word and the sowing of God's word for sexagesima and Septuagesima, and some of those really specific Sundays with the specific gospel lesson. It's kind of interesting. I don't know how that would be measured exactly, her impact, but we do know that they used this hymnal until the early 1960s when they replaced it with service book and hymnal. So there was a generation that did sing her hymns and probably saw her name and was familiar with it. And I'm not from the Augustana Synod or really familiar with that side of the ELCA, but I know that must have affected that specific culture.
All right. All very interesting. So you bring up another one of her projects in your books. Hoppe produced Songs of the Church Year. So kind of what was this and how was it received among Lutherans?
Sure. So her complete hymn cycle was included in this book. and then also a few other topical hymns that she had written before that, mostly in the Northwestern Lutheran, and a few other translations that she had done from the ELG 1872. And I think that it was the complete set of hymns that were supposed to be in the Augustana hymnal that ended up not making it in. And that Hult kind of said, well, they're not going to publish all the hymns in the hymnal, but we'll make sure that they do all get published as a set. So it was published in 1928, which was a few years after that. So it's 200 hymns in all. It was received really well, I think, by all the synods in the Synodical Conference and the Augustana Synod. I think it's Theodore Grabner that says in the Lutheran Witness, "We believe with Professor Hult that many of these songs will pass into the hymnology of the Lutheran Church and into that of the Church Universal." And the American Lutheran, which is also Missouri Synod, said, "Many of the poems contained in this volume are all real gems and deserve a place in our Lutheran Church hymnals." And they also complimented the appearance of the book. It is kind of a pretty book. And it contains a lot of different devotional topics and things. She also says that there were people overseas that read it and sent her letters about it. She notes that it had been sent to Australia and England and Scotland. And I don't know much more about that, but she said that people did read it over there. And it sounds like there are a lot of favorable responses from people that she knew about it too. A lot of the books that you find on Amazon, copies of Songs of the Church here, have her writing in the front, and it's not too uncommon to find her handwriting and an inscription by her, because I think she gave a lot of them as gifts. So it was kind of a popular gift item during the 1920s, it looked like.
That's interesting. You can still get original copies. So for any Lutheran history buff who might be listening to this show, you can. Are you saying you might be able to snag an original with an autograph in it, huh?
Well, it's like you have to keep watching Amazon. And I mean, I actually didn't get mine from Amazon. I borrowed it from my professor, and then he gave it to me as a gift, very kindly. But if you just keep watching the listing, every once in a while it'll pop up, and then it's probably one with her name in it. So yeah, it's pretty cool. Concordia Mequon actually has something with her writing in it, I think. So yeah, it's not surprising that she would have known a pastor in that area.
Yeah, not to verge into the realm of relic hunting, but that's still kind of cool for anyone who likes history to get your hands on.
I love that kind of history book. I'm always looking for something that other people have written in or something like that, and it just makes it more special. So
more personal, good connection. Yeah. So you do note in your book that Hoppe had the goal of writing 1,000 new hymns, and that she got kind of close to that, despite living, in these days we'd say pretty short lifespan, for living barely 50 years. How is that possible?
Well, in one of her obituaries, a pastor says that he thinks it was around 600 hymns. I actually haven't stopped to count them, but I know that there are 200 in Songs of the Church here. And then there are kind of other versions of them in the Northwestern Lutheran. And she was also commissioned to write hymns a lot, I think just for special occasions, which I noted in the book. She mentioned that she did write hymns when she was at work. She would use her lunch break to type up hymns, and she'd come up with hymns going to and from work on the streetcar. She also says in a letter to E.E. Ryden that people were always kind of coming up to her and demanding her to write hymns for them, or, well, very strongly commissioning them. And she'd be sitting at work, and she didn't name names, but she said a well-known pastor in the city came in and wanted a hymn that, for her to write by the next day. So there were a lot of people that knew about her writing, and I think asked her to write special poems and hymns for different occasions and church-related things. So yeah, I don't know how many hymns there are actually, but she wrote a lot and she kept writing, and maybe not all of it, I guess, would be the quality that you'd put in a hymnal or something. It might not have been totally refined, but she loved to write, and she kept at it because that was what she enjoyed.
Yeah, what was her writing process like? I mean, how was she able to just produce that amount of volume? That wasn't her job. She worked elsewhere, right?
Yeah, I don't exactly know, but I think that, like, if you're a really well-read person, I think that it comes more naturally to you. I think she read a lot of poetry herself and a lot of other hymns. And I think that just maybe having kind of those ideas and that kind of experience, she was able to sit down and think about it and just write something. And like with translation, it's really just like composing another original hymn. It's like you make a literal translation first and you kind of stare at the whole thing and come up with the idea for the whole verse and then write it out. So yeah, I think that she was just very well read, and I suppose got very well versed in doing it so frequently. And I don't know, I couldn't write that many poems if I tried, but yeah.
Yeah, I've probably written 5, and that was mandatory high school English assignments, right? So, yeah, I think you mentioned in the book somewhere, or maybe it's her talking about, she like takes her lunch breaks or something, and just spends that time to write. So,
yeah, I think it was her goal, just with her life, to leave the church something that they would still use. And she herself hoped that the church after her death would still continue to use her hymns. It wasn't so much about herself and her personality and everything that she wanted people to know about. She kind of couldn't, she didn't want to really have her name out there as much. She wanted her writing, I think, to shine. In other hymns and things, in the hymnals that she was published in, she mentioned to Ryden and a few others that she didn't want her dates, I guess, published next to her name, like 1889 or something. She just wanted the year that they were written. And she explained that she wanted people to think that she lived long ago and was maybe kind of forgotten about and, belonged to the past. But yeah, she just wanted God to get the praise for her writing, and I think that's kind of the way it happened.
This is the conclusion of part 1 of our episode on Anna Hoppe, the hymn writer from around a century ago. Please come back in 15 days to hear the conclusion.
Now, a few of you have asked if there are ways to support this show. One way is to share the show and its episodes. You can do it via some social media. We do have a Facebook page called the Lutheran History Podcast, and that makes it pretty easy to share on that platform. We also have a standalone website at tlhp.buzzsprout.com. You can share that website or a specific episode with pretty much anyone. However, the best way to share the show is probably through word of mouth. So talk about the show. Tell your friends, colleagues, members, or students. Tell them how much you appreciate a certain episode or a speaker.